Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast, the podcast that introduces you to ordinary people who've done extraordinary things. My name is Barry Eustance, and I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. Welcome to the Success Consultancy's Just Great People podcast. I'm joined today by David Winders, and without further ado, I'll let David introduce himself, and then we'll talk about David's interesting and varied life. Over to you, David.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I've been involved in business architecture. It sounds very grand, but it isn't really, for a number of years. I started off probably about 2001, where I got involved in doing some work with when I was working for Centrica as a business design manager, trying to look for synergies between the British Gas environment and the AA and Goldfish and OneTel as it was at the time. And I got introduced to business architecture and target operating model by a consultancy called Detica. I worked with them for a couple of months and got really quite interested in that. So my career went down that route for quite a long period of time, really. And I got into creating descriptions of future states, target operating models, or TOMs as they're known, to help transformation and implementation teams understand what the business needs to look like in the future to deliver the strategy that's been set by the executive. So I did that probably getting on for 20 odd years now, I suppose, and eventually got into a situation where I was asked to create a training course, and I delivered that business architecture training course and target operating model training courses to a large number of organisations, mostly in financial services, people like Barclaycard, Bank of Australia, Vehicle Licensing Authority down in Swansea, to name a few, Friends Life and others. But basically that's where we are today. Recently in 2024, Barry and I went over to a large public authority in London, and we delivered a 3-day target operating model course to a group of, how many people was it, Barry?
14 people overall.
14, which was quite a large teaching group, actually, and delivered that course, and they were very happy. And we did lots of exercises and practical get-togethers and using all the different techniques that are involved in creating target operating models.
They needed quite a lot of explanation about how it fits in the picture. And what actually, let's start from the beginning. Why is a target operating model or a TOM so important to an organisation?
Well, most organisations create a strategy, don't they? And that will usually consist of a view of what they think they need to do to adapt to the external environment and use the internal capabilities they have within the organisation to deliver that strategy. However, quite often it's written in consultancy type jargon, really, and they throw it over the fence. They walk away. This is the strategy people in the strategy team or external consultants they bring in. They give some very nice PowerPoints of what the strategy actually is, and then the poor program managers and project managers and people have to make it happen, look at it and say, well, what does that actually mean? And that's where the target operating model comes into play, really. It's taking a strategy and saying, well, this is where we are today. What do we need to build or change to make this strategy happen? What do we need to get rid of? Is there anything new we need to do? Is there anything we need to amend or adjust? And it's basically designed to communicate what that strategy means in real terms. What is this place going to look like at that future date that's been prescribed, that the strategy wants to deliver? And it needs to come from all different perspectives, and we call these views. So we're designed it's a communication exercise, really, to explain to different stakeholders with different ideas and different needs to understand what that strategy means to them and the people that they manage. So it's a full spectre of people, process and technology. It's not just one great big IT project, and really that's one of the issues that lots of companies face. They try to solve a problem by putting in a piece of IT, it becomes an IT project, and the people and the process side get left way behind and they end up with a mess. So a target operating model is really a description of a future state to help people understand what they need to do to change business as usual today to what it is in the future. It's probably easier to say what a target operating model isn't, because a lot of people say, okay, I think I understand what a target operating model is, and really they don't. I mean, for example, a lot of HR people think that target operating model is a new org chart. Okay, you do see a new org chart eventually in a target operating model, but it is not just only that. An IT person may look at a systems diagram or a data model or something. They think that's the target operating model. Some people think that it's just a drawing on one piece of paper. Some people think it's a PowerPoint presentation. It isn't really. It is what it needs to be to do the job of communicating to the relevant stakeholders of what the future potentially has got to look at, really.
So it's communication and an articulation of the strategy, organizational and stakeholder wise, isn't it?
It is. It's trying to put some meat on the bones, really, in practical terms, because lots of strategies are full of, dare I say it, weasel words and jargonistic stuff, aren't they? And you need to actually put that into practical terms. What does it mean to the people's lives that have got to work in this company with this strategy moving forward? So, you
have a group of strategists who produce a strategy.
Yeah.
And that then, through the creation of a target operating model, is actually takes that to the functional, the way that the strategy is going to be implemented in the organization. And how that will appear to the individual stakeholder or collective stakeholder groups.
A translation exercise, really, from a cold strategy, which is not often is just a selection of goals and explanation of why those goals are necessary, really. And it translates it to help people who've got to structure change programs effectively of all the bits and pieces that they need to do. So it's an intermediate communication exercise between the strategy on the left-hand side and the program plan. So in the logical towards the beginnings of a physical thing. The word model means a representation of reality. So it's trying to picture what the future is going to look like in terms of how do we do things around here? What sort of people do we need to do it? What's the technology going to support it? What's the customer experience going to be? All that type of thing, really. And we try and create different views from viewpoints which are designed to help people in their world understand what it means. So, for example, a risk manager would have a view that would be presented to them to explain, well, how is risk going to be managed in this organisation? What does it mean to your team, etc.? We might have an operations view or a finance view. So all different ways of because people often don't realise that people think and come from different places than they do themselves. There's big assumptions that people think everybody thinks the same. Well, unfortunately, they don't because of their educational upbringing, their professional background, etc. Yeah.
And in terms of organisations, you've worked with some of the biggest names that people have heard of, and some of the biggest names that people haven't heard of. But
yeah, probably.
At what level would an organisation start thinking in terms of organizational strategy, a strategy for the organization, and a target operating model? Is there a kind of entry level, or is it?
What do you mean? Do you mean in terms of size? Do you mean in terms of size?
Yeah, in terms of size. But where do you think the starting point for a target operating model might be?
Well, the starting point is the strategy, really, isn't it? So
yeah. But in terms of size of organisation,
yeah, I mean, theoretically, you could do a target operating model for an SME or small medium-sized enterprise, can't you? Generally speaking, it tends to be middle to larger organisations within certain sectors that have been exposed to the concept of it, really. But
is that a function? Is that a function of their exposure to it? Is it because they are aware of it, because they have a strategy officer? Is it something that you would perhaps encourage SMEs, startups to actually have as a practice from the outset, or is it something that you feel
I think a lot of people do one without even knowing what it is. They don't know that they're doing a target operating model. So the bigger companies do, obviously, because they've been exposed to it. They have titled roles called business architects and enterprise architects in their organisation who have been exposed to this concept educationally and professionally. But smaller organisations, I've seen some very good pieces of work, and they wouldn't know that was a target operating model at all, but it actually does the job. Yeah. I mean, it's quite interesting. If you read various textbooks on organisational design, it doesn't mention business architecture at all in there whatsoever, but it's all about it. It's just it happens to have a different label.
David has been a contributor to some excellent books on operating models, target operating models.
Yeah, I mean, I did some work with Andrew Campbell. What was it? 2014, I think he published his operating model canvas book. and I contributed some concepts and ideas into that and some examples. And it's one of the techniques that we do teach on our training course. Not the only one, but we teach many different ways of doing it, because I personally don't believe there's one only way of creating a target operating or an operating model. So they're very different techniques. Some of them have different ups and downs and pros and cons, and you choose from the toolbox which you feel is the most appropriate methodology. So I'm not personally into prescribing one way of doing something and insisting that that's the only way, which unfortunately a lot of other organisations and consulting companies do these days.
And your methodology is also very hands-on, isn't it? It's very activity related. It's actually getting people to feel it.
I have a methodology. I just describe a variety of ways of doing things. Some of them overlap, in fact, and so you can choose different tools and techniques which are appropriate to the type of people that you've got in the room. So, for example, the Business Architecture Guild insists that you've got to do business capability maps and things. Well, if you have an executive team that looks at you rather strangely and says, what on earth is a capability? And you have to spend the first few weeks training everybody about what capabilities are, and they still don't get it, then you're flogging a dead horse. You might as well use something else that they understand. Maybe, I don't know, Kaplan and Norton strategy mapping and balanced scorecard techniques, or value chain analysis, or some other way of doing it. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. As long as you achieve the objective of communicating what the future is going to look like to everybody that needs to know, I don't care how you get there, as long as you do the job well. And that's what a lot of people forget. They push the means of how to do it rather than the outcomes and the results of what it produces.
Is there a tendency to overcomplicate these things for a lot of organisations?
I think people get
down in the weeds?
They get too intellectual about it, really. They spend an awful lot of time explaining how these methods work and why you should use them and how wonderful they are. And actually, most clients don't really care. They just want outcomes. So if you produce outcomes, it sells the method that got you there, really. You don't have to spend loads of time running training courses and workshops to explain how to use a methodology. Just get on with it and do it. And as long as the results are right.
So a very practical application. And it should be mentioned that David also, during his training program, and I've watched this with real interest, gets some very fundamental tools out of the toolbox to encourage participants to really understand at a very fundamental level how the processes work. With this very large organization we recently did a target operating model program with, used what David has used for years, encapsulated cards of the objects that can be used within a target operating model build. And the outcome was extraordinary. I've never, I think, seen more engrossed and interested and engaged people as they work through. And that's kind of where you start, isn't it, David? You take it, make sure that people understand it at the fundamental level.
Well, as a qualified adult education teacher for one of my
many hats
things that I do have is that we were always taught that quite a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people learn through doing. So if you just stand up at the front like many commercial trainers do and just PowerPoint them to death for the afternoon, it's not necessarily going to work. So you explain the techniques very, very briefly and then get people to actually try them out, really. I mean, it's risky. I mean, it can go wrong sometimes, can't it? So if somebody doesn't get it and somebody senior then starts getting a little bit cross or whatever, but you've got to take some risks when you do these things, I think. Anyway, I mean, what Barry's talking about is that obviously businesses are made up of different things. Call them objects, it's a fancy word for it, really. A process, a role, an IT system, an input or an output, a product, a customer, all sorts of different things. Obviously, different organisations in different sectors have different emphasis on different components or objects in their business, and we use this to work out how they would communicate to different stakeholders. We say, take a particular stakeholder, finance director, so what's important to them, compliance and profit figures, and then we work out a potential model of how we'd build a model that would tell the finance director what the future is going to look like, different to what it was today. And it did work quite well, didn't it, Barry?
Very engaged. And there is a place in this world for encapsulated cards post-it
Yep.
notes and whiteboards. People get
Yeah, quite
right
often
in
keeping
and
things
right
simple
into
is the
it.
best way. I think
Yeah.
Barry and I often have some interesting discussions because he's a bit of a nerd, really. He loves his software and stuff like that. And I always say, come on, let's just
Doesn't mean you're a bad person.
keep it simple. Yeah. I think sometimes some of this technology can be a little bit overwhelming, and the technology becomes more important than why you're actually using it. So I
And
don't know.
that was also a point that you raised with this you raised generally, isn't it, about how the enterprise resource planning software and the tools that can be used digitally for target operating model can actually drive people down silos. Could you explain that for our dear listener?
Most tools that people buy, first of all, they're very expensive. You're talking £15,000 per seat per license type thing. So they're big investments. They're very technical quite often, and they probably end up having to have an individual that really knows how to drive it properly to work it. They tend to use a use a fancy word here, a meta model, a model of what a model should look like. In other words, a prescribed way of capturing the information and what all the links are. So it's defining what the model would be before you populate it. And then that constrains you, potentially. They tend to suck in information and require you to fill them in with everything you possibly got. So it ends up becoming a complete industry in itself. And there tends to be, this is a personal view, there tends to be a cycle of buy a tool, spend a lot of money on it, get a business case, employ someone to run it, spend a year or two filling it up with stuff. And then you suddenly realise that, you've got a team that's costing you £500,000 a year or something. And then it gets cut and everybody gets made redundant, and then you start again. A bit cynical, but unfortunately I've seen that so many times. So although tools can be quite useful, IT people love them because it obviously helps them manage their real estate, their IT real estate, etc. But they do have their issues, unfortunately. I sometimes feel that keeping things simple and just doing some drawings or using PowerPoint, using some Excel spreadsheets, actually gets to the end quicker and with less cost. But that's just a personal view.
And disclosure, David and I are going to be running target operating model courses starting very soon. By Q4 of 2024, we'll be rolling out 3-day residential courses in addition to the in-house courses. David will be the lead facilitator on those, ably supported by me. I will be there as well, working with the course and the team. But David, could you just explain how those are going to work, how you're going to structure them, what we're going to look at, and what our attendees can expect walking into the room and what they'll have when they walk out of the room?
The first thing we talk about is an overview of what strategy techniques get used. We introduce some of the more recent things like Alex Osterwalder's Business Model Canvas 2010, which is very useful. I wonder sometimes whether that's actually quite a good strategy statement in itself, really, the creation of a logical business model. We start talking about what modelling is. We talk about what views and viewpoints are. We discuss how to look at the as-is or what the current state is and how much time to spend on that, because that can be an industry in itself. We look at different techniques of describing the current state and the future state. We use a number of ideas there, a combination of Business Model Canvas and Andrew Campbell's Operating Model Canvas, which explodes the left-hand side of Osterwalder's work. We use that. We also use a technique called, and there's a dreadful acronym, terrible acronym, this CC-POLDAT, which comes from POLDAT, which was created by the Computer Science Corporation about 25, 30 years ago, with a marketing front end. So it's describing today, describing the future in terms of how it affects the customer's experience, how it affects the channels, where you get your revenue in to your company. Product and proposition, the P. Process. Organisation, which is not just an org chart. This is all about behaviours and culture. And location, which is an interesting one these days with home working. And then the IT bit at the back end. So data. Now, data is shared, I think. It's not just IT, because it's what you store and why you store it and how you store it. It is just as important to the business front end as it is to the people that actually have to do the storage. back in the databases, etc. And then finally, we've got application, which is the different IT applications that deliver some of these things, and then technology at the back end. Now, the DAT bit, the DAT, is not just IT. So if you're doing a manufacturing organisation, it might be the technology that used to cut metal and fabricate and mould and do all sorts of things. So it's not just the IT piece, the technology is important. So we use the POLISM, which is Andrew Campbell's work, which is another acronym, but I think that's process, organisation, location, information, systems, and then the management systems as well. So use those two particular techniques to define what the views are and different ways of explaining things to people. We also introduce strategy mapping, which is Kaplan and Norton, which is a very useful technique as well. All sorts of other things, really, giving people a complete toolbox of things that they can use, that they can pick out and apply. We have some discussions about how to run workshops and what to include in workshops, and then fundamentally then what type of material might you want to produce to explain your future world in your target operating model. I think that's a very brief summary of what the course is.
Yeah, and of course, having watched this process closely, the magic happens when all of these tools, some of the simple stuff we discussed earlier on, and the acronyms all come together in people's heads, and they suddenly go.
It was quite interesting, Barry, wasn't it? Because that particular organisation asked us to create an index of it all. How many items did we have on the index in the end? 40 different tools, wasn't it?
At least. People like to then go to the next stage, which is how do you actually build that out? And that's where we cover it with future workshops after the course. So in 3 days, there's a lot of ground to cover, short coffee breaks, short lunches. Coming to a site near you will be the Sixsess Consultancy Target Operating Model course, facilitated by David as the principal facilitator. I'll be assisting him, and you'll be able to see for yourself exactly what's involved, and also what we then do when we follow up the course with subsequent workshops and post-course support calls. So that's it, David. You're going to come back and we're going to talk more about the other courses that we're going to be running as well.
Sure.
From your large portfolio of capabilities. So target operating model, David Winders, an introduction from us. And David, any last points you'd like to drop in for the benefit of our viewers?
I apologise for talking too much. One tends to get a bit enthusiastic with these things, so I apologise if I rabbited on too much for you.
Enthusiasm has its place everywhere. So, dear viewer and listener, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to listen to the Sixsess Consultancy. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Barry.
So that's it for today's Just Great People podcast from the Sixsess Consultancy. We hope and trust you've enjoyed it. Please join us next time, and please do remember to subscribe. Thanks for joining us.